There is a moment in medicine, every real medic knows it, where the room goes quiet and something shifts. Not the machines, not the alarms, the people. The way they step back, the way shoulders drop, the way the most experienced person in the space exhales through their nose and reaches, almost unconsciously, for the data terminal to begin logging time of death. That's the moment. And Corporal Yusra Dane had learned to hate it more than almost anything else she'd encountered in 11 years of field medicine across 3-star systems, and a war that nobody back on Earth had bothered giving a proper name to. She'd seen it happen to humans, to Kavhari soldiers whose carapaced bodies seized and went rigid before the light left their cluster eyes, to a Telvari diplomat whose respiratory lattice had collapsed somewhere over the outer ring, and whose people had gathered around the stasis pod like mourners at a grave. She'd seen it, she'd hated it every single time. But she had never, not once, in 11 years, seen it happen to a queen. The GSV Alorath was a ship that made human vessels look like children's drawings. That's not insult, that's just fact. The galactic sovereignty vessel Alorath was 9 kilometers of bioluminescent hull plating, living gravity wells, and atmospheric processing chambers the size of small cities. It had been constructed over 47 years by 11 different species, and its navigational AI was, by several measurable metrics, smarter than any Parliament Earth had ever assembled. Yusra had been assigned to it 6 months ago as part of the Joint Interspecies Medical Exchange Program, a program that, in her personal assessment, had been designed by committee, reviewed by bureaucrats, and delivered to the field like a piece of furniture assembled without instructions. She was the only human aboard. She was also, technically, the lowest-ranking medical officer on the vessel, below the Veth Collective's 4-member healer circle, below the Theric field surgeon, Dr. Auric, who had approximately 200 years of surgical experience and was fond of reminding her of this, below even the auxiliary care unit's robotic medical drones that operated with near-flawless efficiency and responded to commands in 37 languages. Yusra responded to commands in one language, English, and sometimes, when she was tired and frustrated, in the particular dialect of profanity that field medics developed after their 3rd bad deployment. She was stationed in the secondary medical bay, which was, and this was not lost on her, about as far from the primary medical complex as you could get without actually leaving the ship. She spent her shifts cataloging xenobiological injury patterns, updating her interspecies first aid certifications, and occasionally treating minor ailments for the small rotation of crew members who wandered into her bay, usually because the primary complex had a waiting period and their discomfort wasn't severe enough to justify it. She had, in 6 months, performed 0 major procedures. She had filled out 411 intake forms. She had been informed, politely but clearly, by Dr. Auric during their 2nd week together, that human medicine, while admirably developed given the species' limited lifespan and resource constraints, was not applicable at the level of complexity encountered aboard a vessel like the Alorath. "You are here to observe and to learn," Auric had told her, in that particular cadence he used that felt like a compliment and landed like a dismissal. "The exchange program benefits from exposure in both directions. Your presence here benefits you, Corporal Dane. In time, you will understand why." She'd smiled. She'd said, "Yes, doctor." And then she'd gone back to her bay and spent the next 4 hours reading every file she could access on Theric surgical technique, Veth collective healing protocols, and the specific physiological differences between the 9 major species aboard the Alorath. Not because anyone asked her to. Because that was what she did. The Queen arrived on a Tuesday, which was a strange thing to note, because the Alorath didn't operate on Earth's weekly calendar. Tuesday was Yusra's internal label for the 2nd rest cycle of the ship's standard rotation, a quiet stretch where the lower decks hummed with reduced activity, and most of the senior crew were in their designated recovery chambers. She was doing inventory in Bay 7 when the ship lurched. Not violently. Not the way it did during void turbulence or when the navigation system corrected against unexpected mass. This was different. A low, resonant shudder, like something very large had exhaled against the hull from the outside. Then the lights shifted. On the Alurath, lighting was biological, bioluminescent strips embedded in the living hull responded to the ship's internal state the way a human face responded to emotion. Green-gold for standard operation, deep amber for alert, red-violet for emergency. The lights went amber. Then, before Yusra had finished registering amber, they shifted to red-violet. Her communicator chimed, not the standard two-tone of routine notification. The 5-pulse cascade that meant all medical personnel, primary complex immediately. She'd heard it once before, during a training simulation. She'd never heard it in the field. She pulled her kit and ran. The primary medical complex of the Alurath occupied an entire deck 14, sometimes called the healer's level by the crew, though nobody seemed to know how that name had started. It was a vast, climate-regulated space divided into specialized chambers for different species' physiological requirements. The Veth Collective had their own sealed cluster chamber. The etheric section was kept at slightly higher atmospheric pressure and a cooler ambient temperature. There was even a small but immaculate human-compatible room that Yusra had visited exactly once, during her orientation. She arrived at Deck 14 to find controlled chaos. Not the panicked, colliding, shouting over each other chaos she'd seen in human field hospitals during bad days. The non-human medical staff operated with a collective precision that was almost eerie, silent communication through their shared biolink, coordinated movements, no wasted steps. But the energy was wrong. She could feel it even without understanding all the signals. At the center of it, a figure on the primary trauma platform. Yusra's brain registered several things at once. First, the figure was enormous. 12 feet of layered chitinous plating, bioluminescent markings across the upper dorsal surface, limbs arranged in the resting configuration of the sovereignty's ruling caste. She'd seen images. She'd studied the files. This was Queen Regent Vashara of the 3rd Sovereignty Fleet, one of 5 ruling queens across the galactic sovereignty, one of the most powerful biological entities in the known galaxy. She was completely, horrifyingly still. Second, there were no active intervention devices on her body. The Veth healers, all 4 of them, were standing at the edges of the platform in what Yusra recognized from her xenobiological studies as the Chevratha posture, withdrawal, the stance of Veth healers when they had concluded their work. Third, Dr. Auric was at the central monitoring console, and his hands were moving in the slow, deliberate pattern of a etheric physician, beginning to compose a formal death record. Yusra stopped just inside the chamber entrance. The room smelled of ozone and something else, something sharp and mineral that she'd learned was the scent of sovereignty blood, which was not red, not blue, but a deep iridescent copper that caught the light like liquid circuit boards. There was a lot of it. She crossed the chamber in 12 steps. What happened? She asked the nearest Veth healer, a junior member of the circle named Esrath, who had, over 6 months, become the closest thing Yusra had to a friendly acquaintance on the ship. Esrath's cluster eyes contracted. The Queen Regent was struck by a splinter weapon during the breach event near Corridor 9. She was brought here 12 minutes ago, perhaps. We have attempted everything within our knowledge. What's her status? Esrath hesitated. In Veth culture, hesitation had specific meaning. It was not uncertainty. It was the pause before delivering something that carried weight. She is gone, Esrath said quietly. Her primary consciousness node has ceased synchronization. Her bioelectric field has collapsed. By every measure we know, by everything the Veth Circle and Dr. Auric have assessed, she is gone. Yusra looked at the queen, looked at the stillness of her, looked at the copper iridescent blood pooling beneath the plating along her left flank, where something had torn through in a way that looked geometrically specific, intentional. The splinter weapon's signature was a rotating molecular blade. It didn't just cut. It disrupted. It interfered at the cellular level, designed specifically to neutralize beings of significant biological complexity. Designed to kill queens. Yusra set her kit down on the edge of the platform and pulled out her scanner. Behind her, Dr. Auric's voice carried across the room with the particular resonance of someone who is speaking carefully, because they are, barely, containing their irritation. Corporal Dane. She didn't stop scanning. The Queen Regent has been assessed by the Veth Healer Circle and by myself. The conclusion is unanimous. She has transitioned. Please. 1 minute, Yusra said. The room went very still. It was the kind of stillness that had texture. Every non-human being in that chamber was processing the same thing. A human, the lowest-ranking medical officer on the vessel, a species that had been in interstellar space for barely 60 years, a person who had filled out 411 intake forms, had just interrupted Dr. Auric mid-sentence and told him to wait. Yusra didn't care. She was reading her scanner. Here is what she found in that first 60 seconds, while the most accomplished xenobiological medical minds in the galactic sovereignty stood behind her and waited, variously, with confusion, offense, and something that was possibly, though none of them would have named it, a fragile and unwanted thread of curiosity. The Queen Regent's primary consciousness node, the biological structure that the Veth and Theric systems monitored as the core indicator of life, was flatlined. No argument. But Yusra's scanner wasn't running Veth or Theric diagnostic protocols. It was running the modified Zenobio assessment suite that she had built herself, over 6 months of quiet evenings in Bay 7, by cross-referencing every piece of sovereignty physiological literature she'd been able to access and integrating it with human cardiopulmonary emergency medicine principles. Nobody had asked her to build it. She'd built it because she had a theory. The theory was this: the sovereignty ruling caste, queens specifically, had a secondary biological structure that no interspecies medical literature addressed directly. She'd found references to it in 3 separate ancient sovereignty texts, 2 obscure xenobiological field studies from the early contact period, and 1 accidental footnote in a Theric medical journal from before the formation of the Joint Exchange Program. The structure was called, in the nearest translatable approximation, the Velhari, the Deep Echo. It was a backup autonomic system, dormant under normal conditions, that existed specifically as an evolutionary response to catastrophic injury. Sovereignty queens had survived extinction-level threats across thousands of years of evolution. Their biology had developed fail-safes that no other species had needed to develop, including a secondary cardiac neural complex that did not connect to the primary consciousness node, and which could not show up on standard Veth or Theric diagnostic scans. It would show up on Yusra's, because Yusra had built her scanner specifically to look for it. And right now, buried under 6 layers of biological shutdown, suppressed to near imperceptible levels by the splinter weapon's disruption field. It was there. Faint, barely a signal, less than 3% normal amplitude. But it was there. Not yet, Yusra said. The silence that followed those 2 words was different from the silence before them. Before, the silence of a room waiting for the human to finish and step aside. After, the silence of a room that had, collectively, stopped breathing. Dr. Auric moved to stand beside her. He was nearly twice her height, and when he leaned over the scanner display, his dorsal fins, which functioned roughly like eyebrows, inflecting his emotional state, rose to their full extension in a configuration Yusra had catalogued as extreme disbelief. "What are you reading?" he asked. "Secondary autonomic complex," she said, "deep in the lower thoracic mass below the primary node here." She angled the scanner. The splinter disruption field crashed her primary systems, but it didn't reach this. It's still firing. Oryx studied the display. His fins moved through several configurations: disbelief, calculation, resistance, recalculation. "The Velhari structure," he said slowly. Yusra looked at him. "You know about it," she said. It wasn't an accusation, not quite. "It is theoretical," Oryx said. "The texts reference it, but the structure has never been demonstrated in a clinical setting. No one has ever observed it functioning in response to catastrophic injury. The consensus within etheric medicine is that the Velhari is vestigial, a remnant." "It's not vestigial," Yusra said, and she was already pulling from her kit, already sorting, already moving through the intervention sequence she had constructed in her head, not in the last 60 seconds, but over the last 6 months, during the quiet evenings in Bay 7 when she had been building toward a theory she hoped she would never need to test. "It's suppressed. The splinter field is still active in her tissue. It's not disruption residue. Look," she pointed. "This pattern here is active suppression. The weapon system was designed to specifically target the primary node, and then maintain a low-level field to prevent secondary system activation." Another pause. "Because," said Esrath, who had drifted closer without Yusra noticing, "the designers of the splinter weapon knew about the Velhari." "They knew," Yusra agreed. "They designed around it. The weapon isn't just a kill tool, it's a stay-dead tool, which means the Queen is not dead," Oryx said. His voice had changed. Not much. A small shift in register in the frequency of his resonance. In etheric speech, it was roughly the equivalent of a man who has just realized the floor he's standing on is not the floor he thought it was. "She is trapped," Yusra said. "Her secondary system is active but suppressed. She searched for the right word. She's fighting. She just can't get through. And if we don't clear that suppression field from her tissue in the next," she checked her scanner, 14 minutes maybe before the secondary system exhausts itself against the suppression. After that, I don't know. Maybe that's actually death." The Veth healer circle had gathered close now. All 4 of them, their cluster eyes arranged in the interlocking pattern that indicated collective focus, the highest form of Veth medical attention. "What is the intervention?" the lead healer asked. In 6 months, Yusra had never heard the lead healer ask a question in that tone, the tone of someone asking because they don't know the answer. "Electromagnetic pulse dispersion," Yusra said, "targeted, matching the inverse frequency of the splinter suppression field. Like," she almost said like a key because that's how she'd visualized it, "like clearing a signal, break the suppression field in the tissue. Give her secondary system room to expand. Then we deal with the actual wounds." "We don't have that capability," Oryx said. "The Alurath's medical systems are not equipped." "I have it," Yusra said. And she pulled from her kit a device that was, to the eye, deeply unimpressive. A handheld electromagnetic field modulator, technically a human trauma tool, used in Earth's military medicine to disrupt shrapnel-embedded electronic fusing devices in wounded soldiers without triggering them. She'd brought it aboard as part of her personal kit, logged under equipment. Human field medicine, 1 unit, and nobody had ever asked about it. She'd modified it, again quietly, over 6 months, in Bay 7. She'd modified it to produce a calibrated output range that extended to the frequencies she'd theoretically mapped against the splinter suppression signature. She had never tested it. She was about to test it on a queen. Part 2. What Yusra did not do in the next 13 minutes was panic. This is worth noting because the situation, viewed from the outside, was the kind of situation specifically engineered to produce panic. She was working on the body of one of the 5 most important living beings in the galactic sovereignty. The wrong move, the wrong frequency, the wrong amplitude, the wrong duration of application could finish what the splinter weapon had started. She was using a device she had built herself, testing a theory she had developed from fragments of ancient texts and footnotes, in front of an audience of the most experienced alien medical professionals in the known galaxy. Any one of them could have told her to stop. None of them did. She thought about that later, much later, when she was trying to understand the sequence of events that followed. Why didn't Oryx stop her? Why didn't the Veth Circle, operating under their sacred obligation to the Queen Regent, intervene? She thought the answer was the scanner reading. Because once the scanner showed the Velhari signal, once it was visible, measurable, undeniably present, the calculus changed. Before the scan, the Queen was declared dead and any intervention was pointless. After the scan, the Queen was not quite dead and any intervention that might help was worth attempting. The threshold had shifted. And in that shifted threshold, Yusra was the only one who knew what to do next. So they let her work. She calibrated the modulator with her left hand while her right tracked the scanner. The suppression field had a frequency signature. She could see it in the tissue readings, a steady oscillating interference pattern riding on the Queen's own bioelectric field, like static over a signal. She needed to produce the precise inverse. Her hands were steady. She'd learned a long time ago to keep her hands steady. It was the first thing the medic trainer at her first deployment had told her. Your hands are lying to your patient. If they shake, the patient thinks they're going to die. If they're steady, the patient thinks they might not. Make your hands lie. She made her hands lie. The modulator's output dialed to frequency 7.3 MHz in the low M spectrum, the theoretical inverse of the splinter suppression signature she'd mapped. She adjusted the amplitude to match the spread of affected tissue, roughly 40 centimeters across the thoracic lower mass, 3 centimeters deep penetration required. She checked her scanner one more time. Velhari signal still present, still fighting, still there. Here we go, she said, to nobody in particular. She applied the modulator. The first 7 seconds, nothing visible. She maintained the application, watching the scanner. The suppression field pattern wavered fractionally, barely, and then steadied. The splinter weapons designers had built in tolerance against disruption. The suppression field wasn't a passive residue. It was active, engineered to resist. She increased amplitude by 15%. The field wavered again. The Velhari signal, that tiny, exhausted thread of electrical activity, responded. Yusra watched it pulse once, twice, the way a buried person responds to the sound of digging above them. She increased amplitude again, 20% above baseline now. She was approaching the edge of her modulator's tested output range. Beyond this, she was operating on theoretical extension of the device's design specifications. The splinter suppression field broke. Not gradually, not incrementally. It broke the way interference breaks when you find the right frequency, suddenly, completely, like static clearing from a channel. The Velhari signal erupted. The Queen Regent's body, 12 feet of chitinous plating, bioluminescent markings, absolute stillness, moved. Not a twitch, not a spasm, a deliberate, powerful contraction of the thoracic cavity, drawing atmosphere into respiratory chambers that had been closed for, she checked the timestamp, 21 minutes. The monitors, which had been displaying the flatline of ceased primary node function, suddenly detonated with activity. Secondary system signals cascading through the Queen's body like a circuit board lighting up from a backup power source. Then, following the secondary cascade, the primary node itself, responding to the restored system environment, beginning to flicker back toward synchronization. Yusra stepped back. Her legs were shaking. She noticed this with the slightly detached observation of someone who has been maintaining very tight control and is now, for the first time, releasing some of it. Her legs were shaking. Her hands were still steady, the discipline held, but her legs were doing the thing they'd been waiting to do for the last 13 minutes. Around her, the Veth healer circle erupted into motion. Not chaotic motion. Veth medics never moved chaotically, but the rapid, coordinated activity of healers who have been given back a patient they thought they'd lost and are making up for every second of lost time. The lead healer's hands were moving through the queen's thoracic tissue in the deep contact assessment pattern, reading the bioelectric recovery directly. Esrath and the other two were managing the monitoring systems, adjusting atmospheric conditions in the chamber to support the awakening secondary system. Oryx moved to stand beside Yusra. He said nothing for a long moment. His dorsal fins were in a configuration she hadn't catalogued before. She'd have to add it later. "You built the scanner modification on your own time," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," she said. "And the device modification?" "Yes." "You have been developing this intervention protocol since I read the footnote in the Theric Medical Journal," she said. "Volume 47, from before the exchange program. There was a case study reference to a sovereignty queen in the early contact period who survived what the author described as theoretically unsurvivable trauma. The author didn't pursue it, classified it as a data anomaly. I thought it was the Velhari responding to catastrophic injury and being misread." Oryx was quiet again. "You thought she might survive before she was even injured," he said. "I thought someone might," Yusra said. "I didn't think it would be her." Another pause. "Dr. Oryx," she said, "she still has the actual wounds. The splinter did physical damage, significant tissue disruption along the left flank. Even with the secondary system active, she needs surgical intervention," he said, and something had shifted in his voice again. The quality of a person who has arrived on the other side of something and is finding new ground under their feet. "Yes, on that, Corporal Dane, on surgical intervention, I will not require your instruction." She almost smiled. It wasn't unkind the way he said it. "I know," she said. "But I will," he added quietly, and with a weight that she felt land somewhere important, "require your assistance." The surgery took 4 hours and 17 minutes. Yusra spent most of it as what she technically was, the lowest-ranking medical officer in the room, performing the functions she was assigned, following Oryx's direction, managing monitoring systems, assisting with tissue stabilization on the secondary system side, which was her domain, while Oryx and the Veth Circle handled the primary surgical repair on the splinter wounds. It was genuinely the most complex medical procedure she had ever witnessed. She filed this away as a fact and tried not to let the word brilliant attach to it, because she was also aware that he had been condescending and dismissive for 6 months extraordinary. 200 years of surgical experience was not an abstraction. It was visible in every move he made, every decision, every call. The Veth Circle worked with him in a way she had never seen them work with anyone else. A seamless integration of Veth, intuitive healing, and Theric surgical precision that was, in its own way, beautiful. She held her place. She did her job. She kept the secondary system stable while they worked, adjusting the Velhari support protocols she developed on the fly, keeping the Queen's backup autonomic functions from either overextending or collapsing back into suppression. At 3 hours and 40 minutes, the Queen's primary consciousness node completed its resynchronization. The monitors confirmed it. The room, which had been operating in the focused silence of high-stakes medicine, responded to this with a collective exhale that was different for every species present. The Veth healers' cluster eyes interlocked briefly. Oryx's fins moved in a configuration she now recognized as relief. The auxiliary drones, which she had not previously thought of as capable of response, made a small, resonant chime that she'd never heard before. She pressed her forehead against her wrist briefly and closed her eyes. The Queen Regent Vashera opened her eyes 3 hours after that. She was moved to the primary recovery chamber, the high-clearance environment reserved for dignitaries and high biological value patients, which Yusra had also never seen before today. It was an immense space, calibrated perfectly for sovereignty physiology, humming with the soft light of adaptive bioluminescent systems responding to the Queen's own recovering bioelectric field. Yusra was there when she opened her eyes. She had stayed because nobody told her to leave, and because she needed to monitor the Velhari recovery patterns anyway, and because, honestly, she needed to see it. 11 years of field medicine. She needed to see it. Queen Regent Vashera's eyes were compound structures, 12 individual visual nodes arranged in a crescent pattern, and they oriented slowly, with the deliberate precision of a system coming back online, across the recovery chamber. They settled on Yusra. Yusra stood very still. In her experience, large and recently nearly dead patients who woke up in unfamiliar environments with unfamiliar people nearby required 2 things: calm and information. She kept her face neutral. She kept her hands visible and still. The Queen studied her for a long moment. When she spoke, it was in standard galactic, the lingua franca of the sovereignty, which Yusra had learned to moderate fluency over the past 6 months. Her voice was resonant and layered, the characteristic multi-harmonic speech of the sovereignty ruling caste, like 3 voices overlapping in perfect thirds. "You are the human," she said. "Yes," Yusra said. "Corporal Yusra Dane, I'm a medical officer on the Alarath. The healers declared me dead." "They did. And you disagreed." It wasn't phrased as a question, exactly, more as a statement being offered for confirmation. "I had information they didn't have," Yusra said carefully, "a different scanning protocol. I was able to detect a secondary biological system that wasn't visible to standard diagnostics." The Queen's visual nodes tracked her. "The Velhari," she said. Yusra blinked. "You knew about it." "Every sovereignty queen knows," Vashera said. "It is not spoken of outside the ruling caste. The knowledge of its existence is strategically contained. It is our oldest biological secret. If our enemies know of it, they can design weapons to prevent it from activating." A pause. "As they did." "The splinter weapon," Yusra said. "It was specifically designed to suppress the Velhari after triggering primary system shutdown." "Yes," the Queen's tone was precise, unreadable, "which means whoever deployed it knew our secret, which is a significant problem." Yusra said nothing. That was above her clearance level, and entirely above her pay grade. "The question," the Queen said, "that I am considering is how a human medic, assigned to this vessel as an observer, knew of the Velhari at all, since the knowledge is supposed to be contained within the ruling caste." Yusra told her, the footnote, the journal, the case study from the early contact period, the 6 months of quiet research in Bay 7, the modification of the scanner, the modification of the field modulator, the theory she had built and tested today, right now, for the first time on the body of a queen. The Queen listened without interrupting. When Yusra finished, Vashera was quiet for a long moment. "A footnote in a Tharic medical journal," she repeated. "Volume 47, Yusra said. "From before the exchange program." "Yes." The author classified it as a data anomaly. "He thought it was an outlier. I thought it was a pattern." The Queen's visual nodes narrowed, not in hostility, but in the expression that Yusra had learned from her xenobiological studies, corresponded to intense cognitive focus in the sovereignty ruling caste. "There is a word," Vashera said, "in the old sovereignty language, the Kari. It means, approximately, one who sees the thread that others overlook, one who follows a path nobody else thought to take. Yusra said nothing. It is not a medical term, the Queen said. It is a philosophical designation, an honorific in ancient usage. Still Yusra said nothing. You are, the Queen Regent said, the first Thakari I have ever actually met. Part 3. The aftermath spread through the Alarath in waves. Not rumors. The ship ran on data, not gossip, and the ship's internal record system had logged every second of what happened in the primary medical complex. By the time the Queen Regent had been stable for 6 hours, the event record had been reviewed by the vessel's senior staff, transmitted to Fleet Command in a priority burst, and quietly but unmistakably begun reshaping every professional relationship Yusra had aboard the ship. The first change was Auric. He came to Bay 7 the morning after, while Yusra was updating her post-procedure documentation. He stood in the entrance for a moment before she noticed him. When she looked up, he was holding a data pad, unusual for him, since his species preferred haptic interfaces, and his fins were in a configuration she'd learned meant careful approach. I have been considering, he said, how to say this correctly. She waited. In 200 years of practice, he said, I have never had a patient declared dead who survived. I have never encountered the Velhari in clinical function. I have never been assisted in a procedure by someone with less formal training than myself who nonetheless brought information that was essential to the outcome. He set the data pad on her counter. It was a certification document, interspecies medical collaboration, senior signature, Tharic Medical Authority. This, he said, formally recognizes the intervention as a collaborative procedure of record. It will go into the vessel's permanent medical archive with your name attached. She looked at the pad, then at him. You argued with me, she said. In the moment, you tried to stop me. I questioned you, he said. There is a difference. I questioned you because the intervention was unprecedented and the stakes were, I don't have words for the stakes. I know. If you had been wrong. I know that too. A pause. You were not wrong, he said. She picked up the data pad. Thank you, Dr. Auric. His fins moved. The configuration she filed later under something that might be respect. The second change was her assignment. 3 days after the intervention, she was summoned to the vessel's command deck, which she had also never visited before, because junior medical officers generally had no business there. The command deck was a vast circular space at the ship's bow, all curving organic architecture and holographic navigation fields, staffed by a rotating crew of senior officers from 5 different species. The vessel's commander, a sovereignty-aligned Veth collective entity called, in standard galactic translation, the Assembled 17, occupied a central coordination nexus and communicated in simultaneously broadcast harmonic speech. Yusra stood before the Assembled 17 and did not fidget. They told her the following. Her assignment was being restructured. She was no longer the secondary medical bay's intake officer and certification clerk. She was being elevated, conditionally, pending formal review by the Joint Exchange Program, to senior interspecies medical consultant, attached directly to the primary medical complex. The Velhari intervention was being formally classified as the first documented clinical demonstration of secondary autonomic activation in the sovereignty ruling caste. Her scanner modification protocol and the field modulator application methodology were being entered into the Alurath's medical system as a new diagnostic intervention standard. She was also being tasked, specifically, with continuing her research into sovereignty physiological systems using the methodology she had applied independently, with full access now to medical archives that had previously been above her clearance. She would work formally alongside Dr. Auric, collaboratively, as an equal contributor. The assembled 17 communicated one additional item, in harmonic frequency rather than speech, a broadcast of collective meaning rather than words. The Queen Regent Vashara had requested, specifically, that Corporal Yusra Dane be granted permanent assignment to the Alorath for the duration of the fleet's current campaign. Not a recommendation. Not a preference. A royal request. Yusra returned to Bay 7 after the command meeting. She sat in her chair, the same chair she'd spent 6 months sitting in, filling out intake forms, studying xenobiological files, modifying a scanner and a field modulator in the evenings while nobody watched. She sat there for about 10 minutes. Then she opened a new file in her research archive and started writing. The preliminary notes for a comprehensive study of sovereignty ruling caste secondary physiology. The Velhari system, its activation parameters, its suppression vulnerabilities, its interaction with known weapon technologies. And this was the part she was most interested in, its possible presence in similar but less studied biological lineages across the galactic sovereignty's allied species. Because the thing about footnotes was, there was usually more than one. And the thing about data anomalies was, they were usually patterns. She went to see the Queen Regent on the 5th day, as part of her standard post-procedure monitoring rounds. The recovery chamber was quieter by then. The initial storm of activity around the Queen's survival had settled into the managed routine of a serious patient on a recovery trajectory. 2 Veth healers were always present. The atmospheric systems hummed. The bioluminescent lighting had shifted from the acute care amber to a warm, deep gold that corresponded, Yusra had learned, to the sovereignty's color of healing. She ran her scans. The Velhari signal was strong and stable now, not the desperate 3% flicker of that first scan, but a full, robust secondary system operating normally alongside the repaired primary systems. The surgical sites were closing with the speed characteristic of the sovereignty ruling caste's accelerated healing biology. She was logging her readings when the Queen spoke. "You are quieter today," Vashara said. Yusra looked up. "I didn't want to disturb you." "You are not disturbing me." The Queen's visual nodes oriented toward her. "I have been thinking about you, Corporal Dane, about what you represent." Yusra waited. "Your species," the Queen said, "joined this community, the galactic sovereignty, the allied networks, the shared governance, 63 of your years ago. You are by any measure the youngest species at the table, the newest voice, the least experienced." "We know," Yusra said. "And yet," the Queen said, "a human medic on her first interstellar assignment, on a ship where she is not taken seriously, in a position where she is expected to observe and learn and stay out of the way, found a footnote in a medical journal that everyone else dismissed, built tools to test a theory that everyone else had abandoned, and used those tools, in the moment when they were needed, to do what every other medical mind aboard this ship had concluded was impossible." Yusra didn't respond immediately. She was thinking about how to say the thing she wanted to say without it coming out wrong. "We've only been out here 60 years, she said finally. "We don't have 200 years of surgical practice. We don't have the Veth Circle's collective healing knowledge or the sovereignty's biological archives. We don't have most of what everyone else here has." "No," the Queen said. "But we've spent our entire history," Yusra said, "fighting things that should have killed us. Disease, environment, each other, things that looked unsurvivable from the outside. We got very good at finding the thing in the corner of the data that nobody else noticed. Because for us, that thing in the corner was usually the only path out." The Queen's visual nodes were absolutely still, focused entirely on Yusra. "60 years in space," Yusra said, "but a very long time before that." A long silence. "Yes," Vashara said softly. "I think that is exactly it." Part 4. The investigation into the splinter weapon attack. Who deployed it? how they had obtained knowledge of the Velhari, and what the implications were for sovereignty security, was not Yusra's department. It was, however, her problem. Not officially. Officially, she was a medical officer. Her job was the Queen's recovery, the documentation of the Velhari intervention protocol, and the continuation of her research. The security investigation belonged to the Alorath's intelligence division, to Fleet Command, and to the Queen's own royal security apparatus, which had descended on the ship within 48 hours of the attack in the form of 6 heavily armored Sovereignty Guard Queens who made everyone aboard extremely nervous. But the weapon's design, its specific calibration against the Velhari suppression frequency, was medical data, and Yusra was the only person on the ship who had mapped the Velhari suppression signature in clinical detail, which meant that the intelligence division needed to talk to her. They sent a representative named Commander Threshold, a sovereignty military officer of the caste just below the ruling queens, formidable, precise, and possessed of the particular quality of stillness that Yusra associated with people who were very good at things she didn't want to think too hard about. They met in the primary medical complex because Yusra had insisted on it. Her ground, her equipment, her data. Commander Threshold studied her with the compound eye focus of someone conducting a very thorough assessment. "The suppression frequency you documented," she said. "You've shared this with Dr. Auric and the Veth Circle." "The full dataset is in the medical archive," Yusra said, "accessible to everyone with clearance above grade 7. That clearance level includes approximately 300 personnel across the fleet." "Yes." "The specific frequency parameters of the splinter suppression field are now part of the medical record." "Yes," Yusra said, "because they need to be. If another queen is attacked with the same weapon system, the next medic on scene needs to know what they're looking at." Threshold's compound eyes tracked her. "That is admirable reasoning. It also means that if the data were accessed by someone with the wrong intentions, the suppression frequency would be available to someone designing the next version of the weapon," Yusra said. "Yes, I know." She'd thought about this. For days she'd thought about it. "Here's what I can tell you," she said. "The suppression frequency I documented is specific to the Velhari signature I observed in Queen Regent Vashara during the intervention. It is not, I want to be precise here, a universal suppression frequency for all sovereignty ruling caste Velhari systems." Threshold stilled. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Yusra said carefully, "that the Velhari signature varies, individual to individual. The frequency I documented is Vashara's. Another queen would have a different signature. The suppression field in the splinter weapon was calibrated specifically to her." The intelligence officer processed this for a moment. "Which means," she said, "that whoever designed the weapon had access to the Queen Regent's individual Velhari signature." "They had to," Yusra said. "A generic suppression field wouldn't work. The calibration is too specific. Whoever built the weapon had biological data on Vashara specifically." Another long silence. "That is," Commander Threshold said quietly, "extremely serious information, Corporal Dane." "I know," Yusra said. "You should have reported this immediately." "I'm reporting it now. I needed to finish the scan analysis before I could be certain." She pulled up her data. "And I wanted to also tell you this. The suppression field's calibration, the specific parameters that were targeting the Queen's individual Velhari signature, they required biological scanning data that could only have come from a proximity scan of the Queen while she was aboard this ship." Threshold did not move, but the quality of her stillness changed, the stillness of a person who has just heard the thing they were afraid of hearing. "You are saying the weapon was built using data obtained on the Alorath," she said. "I'm saying the suppression calibration requires data with that kind of resolution," Yusra said. "I could be wrong, but the mathematics of the field parameters suggest a scan from no more than 30 meters. Possibly less. And the Al-Arath is where the Queen Regent was stationed, Yusra said. Yes. She watched Threshold integrate this. This changes the nature of the investigation significantly, the commander said. I know, said Yusra. I'm sorry. Threshold looked at her, a searching look, the compound eyes tracking through their full range. Why are you apologizing? Yusra thought about it. Because I'm telling you there might be a leak on your ship, and that's never easy to hear. The commander looked at her for another moment. You are, she said, a very unusual human. I get that a lot, Yusra said. The investigation took 3 weeks. Yusra stayed out of it and stayed in the medical complex and kept doing her job, which was the Queen's recovery monitoring and the completion of her research documentation. She saw Threshold occasionally, in corridors, in the brief crossing moments of large vessels, and they exchanged nods but no information. The Al-Arath continued its mission, because a warship does not stop for internal investigations. The Queen remained aboard, in her recovery chamber, which was now, per Royal Security Protocol, accessible only through a checkpoint manned by 2 of the Guard Queens at all times. Yusra had unrestricted access. The Guard Queens did not challenge her. The first time she approached the checkpoint post-investigation launch, they had simply stepped aside, and something in their bearing, in the precise angle of their positioning, communicated that this was not procedural allowance but deliberate permission. The Queen had told them to let her through. She kept up her daily monitoring rounds, and during those rounds, sometimes, the Queen was awake and they talked. Not always about medicine, not always about the investigation. Sometimes it was about the Velhari research. Sometimes it was about the early contact period texts Yusra had found the original footnote in. The Queen had the ruling caste's historical knowledge, passed through generational succession, and she was, Yusra discovered, genuinely interested in the accidental archaeology of her own people's secrets. The journal author, Vashara said one day, the Theric physician who classified the case as an anomaly, why do you think he dismissed it? Because it didn't fit his framework, Yusra said. He was trained to understand sovereignty physiology in a specific way. The case didn't fit. It was easier to call it an anomaly than to rebuild the framework. That is a very human answer. Is it wrong? No, the Queen said. It is exactly right. And it is something that I think, looking at the galactic sovereignty's history with your species, we have done repeatedly with humanity. Yusra looked at her. You do not fit our frameworks, Vashara said simply. Your physiology, your lifespan, your history, your approach, none of it maps cleanly onto existing categories. We have been calling you an anomaly since first contact. Rather than rebuilding the framework, Yusra said. Rather than rebuilding the framework, the Queen agreed. The investigation concluded on a Thursday. Yusra's personal Thursday, the 5th rest cycle. She was in Bay 7, her old Bay 7, where she still kept her research notes and personal kit, even though she now worked primarily in the main complex, when Threshold appeared in the entrance. The commander looked tired, the particular tiredness that Yusra associated with people who had been doing difficult necessary work and had come to the end of it. It was a sensor node in Junction Corridor 18, Threshold said without preamble, modified to perform biological scans of passing individuals and transmit the data. Whoever installed it did so over a year ago. We believe the Queen's scan data was obtained during a routine transit through that corridor approximately 9 months prior to the attack. Who installed it? Yusra asked. We have a suspect in custody. I am not at liberty to share more than that. Yusra nodded. The node, was it designed to look for the Velhari signature specifically, or was it doing general biological scanning? General scanning, Threshold said. The specific suppression calibration would have been derived afterward by whoever processed the data. The node was collecting raw bioelectric profiles. The Velhari signature would have been visible in raw profile data if you knew what to look for. Knew what to look for, Yusra repeated. Yes. So whoever designed the weapon, whoever derived the suppression calibration from the profile data, they knew about the Velhari. That is the conclusion, Threshold said. Which means it wasn't just a technical team who built a weapon, Yusra said. It was someone with biological knowledge of the Velhari. Someone from inside. We are pursuing that question, the commander said firmly. Yusra stopped. Right, she said, above my clearance. Yes, Threshold paused. You will be asked to provide formal testimony about the medical data you shared with me, the scan analysis, the suppression frequency parameters. It will become part of the classified record. Of course, Yusra said. The commander turned to leave, then stopped. Corporal Dane, she said without turning back. Yes. Your intervention in the medical complex, what you did, a pause that had weight to it. I have served the sovereignty for 40 years. I have known queens my entire professional life. I have never, she stopped, adjusted. What you did was not standard, it was not protocol. It was not within any framework I can reference. No, Yusra agreed. In the sovereignty military, Threshold said, we have a concept called Varthesh. It means approximately the action taken at the limit of what is known, the step beyond the mapped territory. It is considered the highest form of tactical courage. Yusra said nothing. You performed Varthesh, the commander said, for a queen you had never met, on a species you had no formal training in, with tools you built yourself on your own time. Still Yusra said nothing. That is worth noting, Threshold said. And she left. Part 5. The Queen Regent's formal recovery was declared complete at the end of the second month. Yusra attended the clearance assessment formally as contributing medical officer, unofficially because she had been there at the beginning and something in her needed to be there at the end. Auric performed the primary assessment. The Veth Circle provided their collective evaluation. Yusra ran her scans last. The Velhari monitoring had become, by this point, genuinely hers. She was the only one who knew exactly what the readings should look like. The Velhari signal was full, stable, beautiful. A complete secondary system operating in healthy synchronization with the repaired primary. The surgical repairs had integrated cleanly. Vashara's accelerated healing biology had done the rest. She was, by every measure, completely recovered. When the assessment was concluded, Queen Regent Vashara stood, and the act of standing, after 2 months of recovery, carried something ceremonial in it. The recovery chamber's bioluminescent systems responded to her restored bioelectric field with a full spectral display, the sovereignty's color spectrum cascading across the walls like a living tapestry. She looked at each of the medical team in turn. When her visual nodes reached Yusra, she held the contact for several seconds longer. Then she said, in Old Sovereignty, a language Yusra did not speak, something that lasted approximately 20 words. Yusra looked at Esrath, who was nearest. What did she say? Esrath's cluster eyes contracted in what Yusra had learned to read as a smile equivalent. She said, Esrath translated carefully, I was dead, and a human the smallest in this room, the newest to this galaxy, the one they placed farthest from my care, said not yet. And she was right. Remember that, all of you. Remember that the one they dismissed looked where no one else looked and found what everyone else had stopped searching for. That is the kind of medicine that matters. Not the medicine of certainty, but the medicine of refusal to accept what seems certain. The room was very quiet. Yusra kept her face neutral. Her legs were shaking again. 6 months later, The Joint Exchange Program received an unusual communication from Queen Regent Vashara of the Third Sovereignty Fleet. It was a formal recommendation, carrying the weight of royal endorsement for the restructuring of the Interspecies Medical Exchange Initiative. Specifically, the recommendation addressed the following: that human medical officers assigned to sovereignty vessels be granted full collaborative standing rather than observer status from the beginning of their assignments. That the diagnostic methodology developed by Corporal Yusra Dane, the cross-referenced xenobiological assessment suite integrating human trauma medicine principles with interspecies physiological data, be adopted as a supplementary standard protocol across all sovereignty medical facilities. That the Velhari intervention case be published, with appropriate security modifications, in the Galactic Medical Archive as a foundational study in interspecies emergency medicine. And that Corporal Dane specifically be promoted, upon her return from the Alurath assignment, to Senior Interspecies Medical Research Officer, a rank the exchange program would need to create since it did not yet exist. The recommendation was accompanied by a single annotation, in the Queen's own hand, in the old sovereignty script. The Kari. Yusra heard about the recommendation on a Friday. Her Friday, the 6th rest cycle. She was in Bay 7, which was technically no longer her assignment but which she still kept, because she'd grown attached to it the way you grow attached to the place where you did the work that mattered. Her scanner modifications were on the counter. Her field modulator was in the kit. Her research files were on the display. She sat in the chair and looked at the message for a long time. She thought about Dr. Auric, who had told her she was here to observe and to learn, who had, eventually, asked her to assist him, who now met her in the main complex every morning and argued with her about xenobiological literature with a quality of engagement that she had reluctantly concluded was the etheric equivalent of deep respect. She thought about Esrath, who had been the first friendly voice on a ship full of enormously competent non-human beings who were all, in their various ways, trying to figure out what to do with her. She thought about Commander Thresh-Cole, who had said Varthesh in the voice of someone who meant it. She thought about the Queen's chamber, the scanner reading, the Velhari signal barely 3% exhausted fighting. Not yet. Not yet. She opened a new document in her research archive and started writing. The preliminary outline of a comprehensive interspecies emergency medicine training program, integrating human medical principles with cross-species physiological frameworks. The kind of program she would have wanted 6 months ago, when she had arrived on the Alurath with a full kit and an observer badge and 411 intake forms ahead of her. The kind of program that would mean the next human medic on the next alien ship would go in knowing what to look for, and knowing that sometimes the footnote in the corner of the journal nobody bothered to pursue is the most important thing ever written. She titled the document, Medicine at the Limit of the Known. She thought briefly about the alternative title. Not yet. She liked both. She kept writing until the rest cycle ended.